yeah, we're back, baby. Who's ready to look at some more horrible video games? I bet you can't wait. The year 1991 is memorable for a number of reasons. Terminator 2, Judgment Day and the Addams Family all hit the big screen, Nirvana released Nevermind, and National Treasure's Rick Mayall and Ade Edmondson returned to our telly boxes with the side-splittingly hilarious Bottom. It was also a decent year to be a gamer, as the likes of Sonic the Hedgehog, Duke Nukem and Sid Meier's Civilization all made their debuts in 1991. If you're familiar with the series though, or at least took a cursory look at the title, you'll know that we're not about to trouble ourselves with good games, and instead we're here to list the biggest stinkers that 1991 has to offer. As ever, games are eligible to appear on a Worst Games Of list if they were released in at least one territory in the year in question, and received a minimum of 7 professional reviews. I'm Ashton from Triple Jump, and here are the 10 worst games of 1991. Number 10, Alien Storm. Genesis, 61%. We don't often kick off one of these lists with a game that isn't terrible, and it does pain us to a certain extent to place Alien Storm in the number 10 slot. By no means is it a great game, but it wasn't the worst we've ever seen either. Alien Storm takes place on Earth, where hostile extraterrestrials have invaded, and the only thing that stands in their way are the Alien Busters, an elite force with the firepower to blast the aliens to Kingdom Come. Players took on the role of either Garth, a man armed with an electrical gun, Scooter, a robot with a lightning whip, or Karen, a woman demanding to speak to the aliens' manager. Alien Storm made no pretense about what it was. A game where players got to shoot aliens in the face. There was no nuance to the plot and no characters with inner turmoil to overcome. For a straightforward beat-em-up, that wasn't a bad thing. And if all you were after was a chance to kick some bad guy butt, then Alien Storm wasn't bad. It controlled well, the combat was satisfying, and the graphics looked quite nice. If you were after something with a bit more substance though, Alien Storm wasn't it. Number 9, Super R-Type, SNES, 61%. Another 61%er on a worst games list? Oh boy, we were spoiled. Indeed, it seems like the best word we could use to sum up 1991 in video gaming would be mediocre, as we take a look at yet another fine but forgettable title. A partial port of the arcade game R-Type 2, Super R-Type is probably most memorable for being absolute nails. Players jump into the cockpit of the R9, an advanced spaceship and humanity's greatest defense against the BYDO Empire. I hear they're a lot less fun than the BYOB Empire, but though they're also a lot less rowdy. The side-scrolling shooter fared okay with critics upon its release, with some praising it for its graphics, sound and additional levels that weren't in the arcade title. Most, however, found the game to be far too punishing, chastising Super R-Type for its tricky bosses, cool but sparse power-ups, and the fact that losing your ship meant going back to the beginning of the level. On top of all of this, the game suffered from massive problems in the slowdown department, though some did comment that it helped with the difficulty as it gave them time to react to obstacles. Silver linings, I guess. Number 8, Bonanza Bros, Genesis, 59%. According to the dictionary, a bonanza is something that is very valuable, profitable, or rewarding. And that being the case, we can only assume that the name Bonanza Bros is meant to be ironic. The game stars Robo and Mobo, or Mike and Spike if you want to get pal about this. Two brothers whose favourite TV show is interrupted by a mysterious and shadowy figure who asks them to break into various locations in order to test their security. Players must then take on the role of Robo or Mobo and retrieve objects in a number of different places. Each of the buildings is crawling with guards, so players must stealth their way around, and being the big brains that they are, Robo and Mobo have boasted that they can get in and out in under 3 minutes. So players are bound by a time limit. Players found that Bonanza Bros graphics were okay, but felt that the soundtrack was grating, the controls were clunky, and the stealth elements were poorly executed because enemy NPCs always seemed to know where the player was. Though the game had a single player mode, it was best experienced with a friend. Though that's kind of like saying Guantanamo Bay is better if you've got a mate with you. Number 7, Darius Twin, SNES, 58.6%. Before anyone asks, no, this is not a game about the lesser-known brother of Baby One More Time murdering one-hit wonder Darius Dinesh. If only. Nope, Darius Twin is, in fact, part of the Darius series, which debuted in arcades in 1987 and has spawned a new title every few years since. Originally released in Japan in March 1991, Darius Twin saw players piloting the Silverhawk fighter jet and attempting to thwart the Evil Alliance. Golly, it sure seems like the fly a plane or spaceship to defeat Megalomaniacal Empire formula was the way to sell games in the early 90s. Gameplay-wise, Darius Twin offered up standard side-scrolling shooter fare. Players started out with limited firepower, but were able to boost this by collecting power-ups, and unlike previous Darius games, these weren't lost if the ship was destroyed, which did make things a little less frustrating. The game worked fine on a technical level, and critics did show some love to the design of the bosses, which were mostly grotesque biomechanical monstrosities. If players had grown tired of ploughing through enemy-strewn levels which accumulated in a boss fight though, then they wouldn't have had a particularly good time with Darius Twin. Number 6. Exile. Genesis, 53.33%. If you were after a great JRPG, then Final Fantasy IV was a good shout. Alternatively, those looking for a bit of dungeon crawling fun could pick up The Bard's Tale. If it was mediocrity you were after though, then you need have looked no further than Exile, a game that filled most of its players with the desire to wander out into the wilderness, never to interact with society ever again. Exile follows on from the events of its predecessor and sees protagonist Sadler teaming up with the powerful leader of the Knights Templar in order to find a mysterious artifact that would allegedly put an end to a religious war. Exile was originally released on PC but was later ported to the Sega Genesis. As was often the case with home console ports at the time, a great deal was lost as the Genesis wasn't as powerful as your average PC. The graphics weren't as colourful, the sound wasn't as crisp, and some cutscenes had to be removed in order to ensure that Exile would run on the Sega Genesis. In short, players ended up with a game that most agreed should be sentenced to a life in exile. Number 5. Lagoon. SNES, 50.25%. We're sticking with rubbish RPGs for the moment as we take a look at Lagoon, a game that was only slightly more exciting than loading a dishwasher. Lagoon is set in Lakeland, a place gripped by the horrors of dirty drinking water and slightly overpriced kitchen utensils. But who would be so dastardly as to pollute the country's rivers? Why, none other than antagonist Zera, who has done so in the hopes that it will allow him to release the creatively named evil spirit that is hiding under Lagoon Castle. In order to resolve Lakeland's many woes, and maybe get their hands on a really good non-stick frying pan, players must jump into the heroic shoes of Nasia, the champion of the light. Critics didn't have many nice things to say about Lagoon. The graphics and animations were subpar, making character movements look jerky, the music was forgettable, the sound was irritating, and the bosses took ages to defeat. Reviewers were also none too pleased with Nasia's sword, which had the approximate range of a potato peeler and roughly the same level of ability to detect collisions as an actual potato. In fact, he'd have probably been better at launching actual spuds at his enemies, as they'd have done a similar amount of damage. Number 4. Double Dragon 2, Game Boy, 49.17%. Double Dragon 2? What are you doing here? You're not a bad game! Although it bore the same moniker as the 1988 title, Double Dragon 2 for the Game Boy actually had little to do with Double Dragon 2 found in arcades, but was actually a localization of the Japanese game, and bear with me here because I'm about to butcher this, Neketsu Koha Kun I Okun Bangai Ranto Hen. I'm so sorry. We're told by people who know far more Japanese than we do that this translates as Hot-Blooded Tough Guy Kunio, The Further Brawls, which would have made for an altogether less confusing title than Double Dragon 2. Players take control of Billy Lee, a martial artist who's been hunted down by the Scorpions for murdering one of their members. It turns out that he's been framed though, and players must fight through hordes of gang members in order to find the true culprit. Though there was a little fun to be had initially, players soon got bored of the repetitive gameplay, which consisted of little more than fighting through a bunch of goons to get to a boss. Billy was only capable of a handful of moves, and so most enemies could be bested by button mashing. If you're after a nostalgic beat-em-up experience, then do yourself a favour and seek out Double Dragon 2 The Revenge, and not this pale imitation. Number 3. Fatal Labyrinth, Genesis, 46.67%. We're back in bland RPG land now, as we take a look at Fatal Labyrinth, a game that was approximately as exciting as a documentary about carrots. The plot of Fatal Labyrinth, like the rest of the game, wasn't really anything to write home about. Players took on the role of protagonist Trikar as he ascended the multiple levels of a castle in order to retrieve the Holy Goblet, which, if not returned, would cause the world to fall into eternal darkness. Fairly standard fantasy stuff. The main issue reviewers had with the game was that it was repetitive. The roguelike procedural generation of levels meant the players would never experience the same run twice, but that wasn't enough to keep it from being dull. Players also found that the game failed to give them the items they needed, turning the whole experience into an incredibly frustrating one. Although Fatal Labyrinth made its debut in Japan in 1990, it didn't make its way to Western shores until 1991. Considering just how plops it was though, those in North America and Europe who did play it probably wished it had stayed in the East. Fatal Labyrinth? More like fatal mistakes were made when developing this game? Got 'em. Number 2, Zero Wing, Genesis, 43.33%. Even if you don't recognise the name of this, we can almost guarantee that you'll be familiar with one particular aspect of it. I am of course talking about the All Your Base Are Belong to Us meme that's been floating around the internet for many years, spawned by the opening cutscene in Zero Wing that was poorly translated into English from the Japanese original. Sadly, the bad translation of the dialogue is about the only memorable thing about Zero Wing. The game follows pilot Trent as he attempts to liberate the Earth from the alien cyborg, Cats. The gameplay was of the side-scrolling shooter variety. Players were placed in control of the Zig space fighter and given the task of taking down Cat's minions across 8 different levels. The main issue with Zero Wing was that it was completely forgettable, giving players nothing more than a paint-by-numbers shooter experience. The gameplay was enjoyable, though some critics found many of the levels to be far too easy. The visual and audio presentation was okay, but nothing out of the ordinary, and the controls worked just fine. In short, aside from some slightly wonky dialogue, Zero Wing didn't really do anything wrong, but everything it did right, it did in a way that had been done before. And number 1, Galaxy Force 2, Genesis, 36.67%. Before we get into this one, we need to get a few things straight. Galaxy Force 2 is not, in fact, a sequel to 1988's Galaxy Force, but is instead an enhanced version of it. Think of it as Galaxy Force 2.0 rather than Galaxy Force 2. Everybody clear? Good. Now we can get onto the public shaming. Galaxy Force 2, like Galaxy Force, was a space combat simulator where players assumed control of the Tri-Z, a starship on a mission to take down the Fourth Empire. Each level involved maneuvering the ship through different worlds, shooting down enemies and avoiding obstacles. The galling thing about Galaxy Force 2's appearance on this list is that the original Galaxy Force was pretty damn good. Sadly, because of the technical limitations of the Genesis, a great deal of the game's features had to be scaled down. The frame rate was slashed, the textures were simplified, and the sprite scaling made the visuals look jerky. Galaxy Force was a great arcade title, but Galaxy Force 2 for the Sega Genesis was the absolute worst way to experience it. So, well done Galaxy Force 2. You will forever be remembered as the worst game of 1991. We hope it doesn't keep you awake at night.